Malcolm X was an African American civil rights leader prominent in the Nation of Islam. Until his 1965 assassination, he vigorously supported black nationalism. Malcolm X was a minister, human rights activist, and prominent black nationalist leader who served as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and 1960s. Due largely to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members at the time he was released from prison in 1952 to 40,000 members by 1960. A naturally gifted orator, Malcolm X exhorted black people to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. The fiery civil rights leader broke with the Nation of Islam shortly before his assassination in 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, where he had been preparing to deliver a speech. Malcolm X was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. Malcolm X's birth name was Malcolm Little. He was the fourth of the 8 children born to Mother Louise, who was a homemaker, and a father, Earl Little, who was a preacher. His father was also an active member of the local chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and a avid supporter of black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. As vocal supporters of Pan-African leader Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X's parents faced constant threats from white supremacists. Just before Malcolm's birth, for example, armed Ku Klux Klansmen rode out to their house in Omaha, Nebraska, and shattered all their windows. Due to his father, Earl Little's civil rights activism, the family was subjected to frequent harassment from white supremacist groups including the Ku Klux Klan and one of its splinter faction, the Black Legion. The harassment continued when Malcolm was 4 years old and local Klan members smashed all the family's windows. To protect his family, his father, Earl Little, moved them to Omaha to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1926 and then to Lansing, Michigan in 1928. However, the racism the family encountered in Lansing proved even greater than in Omaha. Shortly after, the family moved in, a racist mob set their house on fire in 1929, and the town's all-white emergency responders refused to do anything. His father, Earl Little, moved the family to East Lansing, where he built a new home. 2 years later, in 1931, his father, Earl Little's dead body was discovered lying across the municipal streetcar tracks. Malcolm was only 6 years old. Though the authorities ruled his father's death an accident, African Americans in town believed the Black Legion had beat him and placed him on the tracks to be run over. To this day, no one knows for sure. Malcolm also lost other relatives to violence, including an uncle he said was lynched by whites. Although Malcolm X's family believed his father was murdered by white supremacists from whom he had received frequent death threats, the police officially ruled his father, Earl Little's death, a streetcar accident, thereby voiding the large life insurance policy he had purchased in order to provide for his family in the event of his death. Malcolm X's mother never recovered from the shock and grief over her husband's death. In 1937, her mother was committed to a mental institution where she remained there for the next 26 years. At first, Malcolm stayed with the neighbors. As early as age 9, with his family in dire economic straits, Malcolm began robbing food from stores in Lansing. Later, Malcolm and his siblings were separated and placed in foster homes. In 1938, Malcolm was kicked out of school and sent to juvenile detention home in Mason, Michigan. The white couple who ran the home treated him well, but he wrote in his autobiography that he was treated more like a pink poodle or a pet canary than a human being. He attended Mason High School, where he was one of only few black students. He excelled academically and was well liked by his classmates, who elected him as a class president. A turning point in Malcolm Little's childhood came in 1939 when his English teacher asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he answered that he wanted to be a lawyer. His teacher responded, "One of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. You need to think for something you can be. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" His teacher told him black people can't be lawyers. Having thus been told in no uncertain terms that there was no point in black child pursuing education, Malcolm X dropped out of school the following year at the age of 15. After quitting school, Malcolm X moved to Boston to live with his older half-sister, Ella. Ella landed Malcolm a job signing shoes at the Roseland Ballroom. However, out on his own on the streets of Boston, Malcolm X became acquainted with the city's criminal underground and soon turning to selling drugs. He got involved in drug dealing, gambling, and prostitution rackets, spending much of his time in seedy nightclubs. At age 19, he was arrested for the first time for allegedly stealing and pounding his half-sister's fur coat. A second arrest followed for allegedly mugging an acquaintance at gunpoint, and a third arrest came after he burglarized a series of Boston area homes. In 1946, Malcolm X was arrested on charge of larceny and sentenced to 10 years in jail. To pass the time during his incarceration, he read constantly, devouring books from the prison library in an attempt to make up for the years of education he had missed by dropping out of high school. He settled down and began voraciously devouring works of history. The horrors of slavery made a particular impression on him, as well as virtually all other non-fiction he could get his hands on. He even tried memorizing the dictionary. Also, while in prison, Malcolm was visited by several siblings who had joined the Nation of Islam, a small sect of black Muslims who embraced the ideology of black nationalism. The idea that in order to secure freedom, justice, and equality, black Americans needed to establish their own state entirely separate from white Americans. Meanwhile, following the example of his siblings, he joined the Nation of Islam and struck up a correspondence with its leader, Elijah Muhammad. Upon leaving prison in 1952, Malcolm moved to his brother's house near Detroit, where he attended the local Nation of Islam mosque and actively sought out new converts. Dropping his surname Little, which he considered a slave name, in favor of the letter X, he quickly became a favorite of Elijah Muhammad, who prompted him to a minister prior to dispatching him to Boston and Philadelphia to establish new mosques there. He took the name X to represent his unknown African name. Now, a free man, Malcolm X traveled to Detroit, Michigan, where he worked with the leader of Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, to expand the movement's following among black Americans nationwide. Malcolm X became the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem and Temple No. 11 in Boston, while also founding new temples in Hartford and Philadelphia. In 1960, he established a national newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, in order to further promote the message of Nation of Islam. Malcolm then spent a decade as a head of Harlem Mosque, in addition to launching a National of Islam newspaper, giving speeches at dozens of universities around the country, participating in debates with mainstream civil rights leaders, and occasionally meeting with foreign heads of state. Articulate, passionate, and an inspirational orator, Malcolm X exhorted black people to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. His militant proposals, a violent revolution to establish an independent black nation, won Malcolm X a large number of followers as well as many fierce critics. Due to the efforts of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members at the time he was released from prison in 1952 to 40,000 members by 1960. He transformed the Nation of Islam from little-known movement into national phenomenon. He initiated a newspaper in 1960 named Muhammad Speak to decimate the message of Islam. Reputed universities like Harvard and Oxford invited Malcolm X to speak in front of students for his oratory and debating quality. Malcolm X was in favor of violent revolution to establish an independent black nation by any means necessary. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X had emerged as a leading voice of radicalized wing of the civil rights movement, presenting a dramatic alternative to Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of a racially integrated society achieved by peaceful means. A rupture with Elijah Muhammad proved much more traumatic. In 1963, Malcolm X became deeply disillusioned when he learned that his mentor Elijah Muhammad had violated many of his own teachings, most flagrantly by carrying on many extramarital affairs. Elijah Muhammad had in fact fathered several children out of wedlock. Malcolm X's response to the question about John F. Kennedy 1963 assassination did not sit well with the American public. Even Elijah Muhammad, leader of Nation of Islam, distanced himself from Malcolm X for his statement. Malcolm X suggested JFK brought his assassination on himself and he was not at all sad about his murder. Malcolm's feeling of betrayal combined with Muhammad's anger over Malcolm's insensitive comments regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy led Malcolm X to leave the Nation of Islam in 1964. Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam due in part to testimonies of sexual harassment against the leader Elijah Muhammad. That same year, Malcolm X embarked on an extended trip through North Africa and the Middle East. Malcolm X also made the Hajj, the traditional Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia. After his pilgrimage to Mecca, he changed his views completely and converted to Sunni Islam. He changed his name from Malcolm X to El-Hajj Malik el-Sahabaz. The journey proved to be both a political and spiritual turning point in his life. He learned to place the American civil rights movement within the context of a global anti-colonial struggle, embracing socialism and Pan-Africanism. After his epiphany at Mecca, Malcolm X returned to the United States less angry and more optimistic about the prospect for a peaceful resolution to America's race problems. During the remaining months of 1964, Malcolm's conflict with the Nation of Islam intensified. He was considered a traitor by the organization's leadership for his criticism of Elijah Muhammad. Now he started criticizing Elijah Muhammad for his religious fakery, prompting the Nation of Islam to take revengeful action against him. He began receiving death threats. Several attempts on his life were made, including one on Valentine's Day 1965 when his home was firebombed. The house was destroyed, but the family escaped unharmed. On February 21, 1965, several days after his home was firebombed and destroyed, Malcolm X was assassinated. He had just begun speaking to the Organization of Afro-American Unity at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. As his pregnant wife and 4 daughters sat at a table near the stage, 3 gunmen rushed at the stage and began shooting at close range. His wounds were fatal. Within several minutes, he was rushed across the street to Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, but the doctors were unable to save him. His killers were from the Nation of Islam. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were sentenced to life in prison for murdering the activist. Malcolm X married Betty Sabaz in 1958. They had 6 daughters, including 2 twins, who were born after his death. He held a number of beliefs that helped the black people find their role in the United States. His beliefs were that black people were the original people of the world and that they have more rights than white people. He believed that white people were doubles and the all black were superior to all whites. Thank you.